Hey boys and girls, it's Miss Caldwell, and today we're going to be reading chapters 11 and 12 of the Landry News by Andrew Clements. We're continuing our look at how our character setting and events are evolving throughout the story. We want to make sure that we're paying attention on how they change and how things are connected throughout the chapters. Alright, so I hope you enjoy these chapters. Chapter 11, Trimmer's Point to Major Quake. A copy of the second edition found its way to the office because the principal's secretary, Mrs. Cormier, had found one on the floor in the hallway. She thought Dr. Barnes would enjoy reading the article about the best teachers. Dr. Barnes sat down at his desk and read every word of the newspaper carefully, nodding and smiling now and then. This was good, clean fun. Excellent writing, a fine learning experience. The bit about the top 10 least favorite foods was cleverly done, and the story about favorite teachers was written in a very positive way. The writers didn't take any cheap shots. There was no foul language. There was no criticism of the school administration, or school policies. There was nothing even a little bit controversial about the second edition of the Landry News. But when Dr. Barnes read the editorial, his eyes narrowed and his heartbeat quickened. A scowl formed on his broad, fleshy face, and his nostrils flared and quivered. He reached for a red pen, took off the cap, and starting over, he read through the entire paper again, looking for a problem, any problem. But when he was done, he had only circled one item on the whole page. It was in the editorial. He had drawn a heavy red circle around one name, Mr. Larson. Dr. Barnes had strong opinions about Mr. Larson. For the 7 years Dr. Barnes had been the principal of Denton Elementary School, Mr. Larson had been a constant problem. Dr. Barnes didn't hate Mr. Larson. That would be too strong a word, too emotional. This had nothing to do with feelings, he told himself. This was a matter of professionalism. Dr. Barnes disapproved of Mr. Larson because Mr. Larson did not behave professionally. For Dr. Barnes, education was serious business, and Mr. Larson took his educational responsibilities too lightly. Dr. Barnes opened his desk drawer and took out the key to the file cabinet where he kept the records about each teacher at Denton Elementary School. Swiveling around in his chair, he unlocked and opened the wide file drawer. It wasn't hard to find Mr. Larson's file. It was 3 times fatter than any other file in the drawer. Every year, Dr. Barnes got letters about Mr. Larson from worried parents. Parents asked if it was normal to have no homework in social studies, no homework in reading, and no homework in English. No homework at all for the whole year. Parents wrote to ask if their children could be transferred to the red team, and the real reason was always the same: getting out of Mr. Larson's class. At the end of every school year, each teacher was required to have a meeting with the principal. It was called a performance review. Dr. Barnes flipped through the stack of performance review sheets he had filled out for Mr. Larson, one for each of the last 7 years. Poor, poor, unacceptable, poor, unacceptable, unacceptable, and unacceptable. At the bottom of each review form, there was room for a brief statement from the teacher. Over the past 7 years, every statement from Mr. Larson had been pretty much the same. Turning to the last year's review sheet, Dr. Barnes gritted his teeth and read what Mr. Larson had written. It is clear that Phil and I have very different philosophies of education. I sadly acknowledge that he objects to some of my methods and practices. Sincerely, Carl A. Larson, teacher. Many parents thought that Mr. Larson should not be a teacher. Several school board members thought that Mr. Larson should be fired, and several other board members thought it would be nice if Mr. Larson retired early. But as every principal and every school board knows, getting rid of a teacher is not an easy thing to do. There has to be something serious, something provable, something that violates school policies or something that violates the law. Dr. Barnes closed up Mr. Larson's fat file folder, put it back in the drawer, shut the cabinet, locked it, and dropped the key back into its place. He set the copy of the Landry News in the center of his desk blotter. Then he laced his fingers behind his head and leaned back in his chair. He smiled. He had a good feeling about this little paper. This situation had possibilities. This could turn out to be just what a lot of people had been hoping for. Sitting up suddenly, Dr. Barnes reached for his phone. He punched Mrs. Cormier's extension. He could hear her bustling around behind him out in the main office area, no doubt getting ready to leave. He could have swiveled his chair around and talked to her, but he enjoyed using the phone. It seemed more official. The phone on Mrs. Cormier's desk rang 1, 2, 3, 4 times. She finally answered. "Yes, Dr. Barnes." There was an edge to Mrs. Cormier's voice. It was 4:15 on a Friday, and she was in no mood for secretary games. Standing at her desk with her coat and hat on, Mrs. Cormier could see Dr. Barnes sitting there, 15 feet away, drumming on the desk with his fingers. Really, how hard could it be for him to just swing around, smile, and talk? Yes, Miss Cormier. Please put a note into Mr. Larson's box for me. I want him to meet with me Monday right after school. Right after school. It's a matter of some importance." Mrs. Cormier hung up her phone and called through the open door. "Monday is Columbus Day, Dr. Barnes, but I'll leave him a note about a meeting on Tuesday, and then I'll be going. Have a good long weekend now." Mrs. Cormier scrawled a hasty note onto a sheet of Dr. Barnes's stationery, stuffed it into Mr. Larson's mail slot, and was out the door in 30 seconds. So obviously she was ready to go home, and kind of aggravated with him for, first off, he could have done it himself, but second off, he could have just asked her. They were close enough that they could have just talked without using the whole phone thing. Alright, so that's kind of paying attention to characters and see what's going on. Also, you should notice in that chapter that Dr. Barnes is definitely trying to set things up for Mr. Larson, and he's going to use the paper to do it. Alright, chapter 12. Growth spurt doesn't hurt. On Tuesday afternoon, Mr.